In Roman mythology, the god Janus personifies beginnings and endings, passages, and most importantly, duality. When looking at modern history, these characteristics of Janus are often present. In recent times, one of the most two-faced events in the Afghanistan War. The war is the longest, still ongoing U.S. war, and as such, comes rife with its own duality and its triumphs and tragedies. To fully understand the U.S.-Afghan War, one must look at the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. In 1973, Mohammed Dawood came into power through a coup in Afghanistan, outstanding King Zahar. Dawood's coup was reliant on the pro-Soviet army and the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA. But the PDPA was split into two factions, the Parklamists and the Khalqis, foreshadowing the instability of the government. The Parklamists supported Dawood, while the Khalqis, led by Noor Taraki, never recognized his leaderships. Dawood's attempt to govern the Islamic tribal regions, move Afghanistan away from the Soviet influence, and mend the split in the PDPA. In 1978, the Khalqis rose to power by killing Dawood and his family. This marked the start of the new communist regime in Afghanistan led by Taraki. The Parklamistic government enacted communist policies, equality for women, changes in family law, and redistributing land from tribes to farmers. The land reform pushed Islamic tribes into armed rebellion. They formed the Mujahideen, an umbrella term for Islamic fighters waging jihad against the communist government for Islam. The Mujahideen insurrection started to grow and threaten the government. Taraki made an agreement with the USSR, which promised to intervene if the Afghan government couldn't handle it. The Soviets soon believed they couldn't handle it and invaded on Christmas Eve 1979. At this point, the U.S. had been supplying the Mujahideen with non-lethal aid. After the initial invasion, the war quickly turned into stalemate. About 100,000 Soviet troops occupied the cities, large settlements, but the rural regions belonged to the Mujahideen, who invaded the Soviets through guerrilla tactics. The Soviets turned to brutal tactics and retaliation. To eliminate support to the Mujahideen from the people, the Soviets bombed civilian targets and depopulated rural regions. This displaced 2.8 million people into other countries. This truly starts the long list of catastrophes that make up most of Afghan's modern history. The Mujahideen were not alone in their fight, though. The U.S. gave money and arms to Pakistan, who would pass it to Mujahideen. Pakistan received $3 billion in military aid from the U.S. Eventually, the Soviets needed to leave because of the huge financial drain and loss of life. They totally withdrew on February 15, 1989.
The Soviet-Afghan War may have finished, but the damage done to the country was immense. The main point of damage comes from the Mujahideen. During the war, the Mujahideen were comprised of several separate groups, all of which were politically independent. These groups quickly turned into warlords who fought against one another for power in Afghanistan. This vacuum of power allowed the Taliban to rise to the top. They were founded in Kandahar in the south of Afghanistan on the principles of Wahhabism, a strict interpretation of the Quran. This entailed excluding women from working and depriving them of rights. The Taliban installed an oppressive reign over Afghanistan by beating and killing warlords. Guidance from Osama bin Laden and sympathetic Arabic countries allowed the Taliban to take control of Afghanistan as the government. Come 2001, on September 11th, the Twin Towers in New York City were struck by two planes, killing nearly 3,000 people. A swift and harsh reaction was promoted by the U.S., and the war on terror in Afghanistan started on October 7, 2001. The U.S. attacked Afghanistan because the Taliban were thought to harbor al-Qaeda in the country, and the U.S. soon invaded. The U.S.-Afghanistan war had officially started. Despite being a war, the conflict would allow the U.S. to help the Afghan people. Each event in the Afghan war represents duality in its own way. No event is strictly good or bad. This goes for the U.S.'s impact on women's rights in Afghanistan. The Taliban believed in an austere reading of the Quran called Wahhabism, which led to very strict laws such as prohibiting women from public life and the workforce. In his book Unholy Wars, John K. quickly states, the price paid by the reigns of Afghan society, however, was horrendous. It included the virtual enslavement and sequestration of women. Zoya's Story by Zoya, with John Filane and Rita Cristofari, tells actual stories from women in Afghanistan. Zoya writes, she told me that her mother had gone to the hospital for treatment. Soon after reaching the hospital, she had suffered an asthma attack and had taken off her burqa as she fought for breath in the ward. A Taliban had burst into the ward and given her mother 40 lashes. This woman removed her burqa so as to not suffocate and was whipped for it. Events such as these were all too common in the Taliban regime. The U.S.'s intervention helped to change that. During peace talks in early January of 2019, U.S. and Taliban officials sought a resolution to the war. A major talking point during the conference was women's rights. A high-ranking Taliban member told Al Jazeera, "It won't be the same for women like it used to be during our regime in Afghanistan. They will have access to education and will have their rights." The conditions for women in Afghanistan have drastically improved to the point that the Taliban are offering to restore women's rights to what they once were. On the other hand, once the U.S. pulls its soldiers from Afghanistan, it will be nearly impossible to enforce any commitment to gender equality the Taliban makes during future peace talks. And the U.S. has not been completely successful in promoting parity. The United States Agency for International Development spent $280 million on its program Promote, the biggest single investment in global women's rights by the U.S. A watchdog report found that it was an utter failure. While it may seem that the U.S. triumphed against the extreme sexism of the Taliban, the deeper truth is that past efforts have not been so successful, and the future for half of the country's population is looking quite uncertain.
Some of these abuses by the Taliban may constitute gross human rights offenses, namely serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law that in turn qualify as crimes under international law. This quote from Mark Drumble's The Taliban's Other Crimes shows the Taliban precedent of brutal behavior towards the people in Afghanistan. Its long list of crimes includes forced deportation, massacres, and torture. In May of 2000, the Taliban slaughtered prisoners and aid workers, torturing many before killing them. The Human Rights Watch found 31 bodies, 26 of which were civilians in Robatak Pass on the border between Baghlan and Shemanigan provinces in north-central Afghanistan. Continuing with the list, the Taliban destroyed cultural sites such as the Bahamian Buddhas, reducing the 1,500-year-old stone Buddha to almost nothing. Also, their crimes against humanity include the subjugation of women and their trials. The opposite face to the humanitarian issues in Afghanistan is the good humanitarian aid the U.S. brought over. The Red Cross started its mission in 1987 and stayed committed through the war to help people affected. They have also brought aid to the families in need. The Red Cross partnered with the Afghan Red Crescent Society to build hospitals and 47 local clinics, which received technical and financial support from the Red Cross. Hospitals in Afghanistan lacked the experience and technologies to perform difficult surgeries. Echelon 3 had 2 hospitals in Afghanistan which performed difficult neurosurgery. Between November 2010 and April 2011, they saw 63 cases, 43 of which were on Afghan people, and 27 of all cases were humanitarian. They saw many children, a lot of which could not eat or walk. Sam Moore, when asked if he believed that the U.S. helped the people in Afghanistan, responded, "Honestly, I do. I know that there was a lot of good programs that we implemented, like aid and funding. The war had its triumphs with the humanitarian efforts, but being a war, it has its ugly face. Any war destroys the country it is taking place in, and this one in particular has been raging on for 18 years. The first involvement of U.S. forces in Afghanistan was a bombing campaign against the Taliban during Operation Enduring Freedom. In Afghanistan, 2,216 military casualties and 20,057 wounded were sustained during Enduring Freedom. The U.S. does its best to avoid civilian deaths and destruction of property, but it's unavoidable. In Dagger 22 by Michael Gomblensky, he writes about his experience in Afghanistan. He states, "Both bombs detonated and completely destroyed all the structures in the immediate area. The 2-story building erupted from the inside and was heaved off the ground before falling into a million pieces. The smoke, dirt, and debris engulfed the center of the village and could be seen from anywhere in the valley. The war ultimately destroyed a lot of the country, along with the actual cost of the war. The total cost of the war was just about $1.03 trillion, with about $45 billion of annual taxes heading towards the war. This war has destroyed the Afghan country for 18 years and cost everyone. This war has raged for 18 years, thus producing a unique set of events that has formed a natural duality almost by nature. The war has brought aid and advanced medicine to Afghanistan to help. Also, the U.S. has made an attempt to help women's rights. On the opposite side, women still suffer under oppressive regimes. The Taliban has committed many human rights violations, and the war has wreaked havoc on the country. The biggest tragedy of the Afghan war, though, is the bleak fact that after 18 years, the U.S. hasn't accomplished their goals. The U.S. is looking to leave while the Taliban still have control of the country, and the women's situation hasn't improved. In talks with the Taliban, President Trump is likely to forget about human rights, leaving them stranded and desolate against their aggressors. Maybe we can remedy this tragedy. However, the United States is searching for a quick exit that's likely to leave women destitute and leave Afghanistan accomplishing none of the goals it set after the 9/11 attacks.